Here to talk a little bit about Afghanistan, which is an important topic. It's also marked the first sort of opening session of the forum this morning. You were in the main hall. Talk us through the experience of that conversation between these two young Afghani women.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you for having me in this discussion. I have to say that the last couple of days have been very hard. We thought that we were at a juncture. The Taliban had made this commitment now that seemed increasingly probable, increasingly likely that they were going to open up schools for girls. It's a discussion that we'd been having with them for months. We had gone through, where they anticipated challenges, identified how the international community could support. And we all started to believe that this was going to happen, and that in some ways it could be an inflection point. And that morning, I just remember suddenly getting the news that this was not happening. And I began with the hope that, maybe it's just a province here or there. Maybe there's just, at the sub-national level, they haven't gotten the memo. And then it turned out that it was a decision made by the leadership. And I think it was really crushing, most crushing for the girls of Afghanistan. I mean, it was just so painful to see these young girls full of hope with their, uniforms on, their white veils and black outfits, getting ready to go to school and being turned away. And I think it broke the world's heart to see that. Everyone has known what Afghan women have been through for decades, and that was just, devastating. And we've been having conversations the last couple of, since then, very sobering conversations in terms of what this leads to, what this implies. And then we walk into the Doha forum and had no idea, and they start off the program with giving this award to Roya Mahbub, this brilliant, beautiful woman, and she's being interviewed by another brilliant, beautiful Afghan journalist. Like, this is the other Afghanistan. This is the Afghanistan of hope, of innovation. This is a young woman who grew up with immense challenges, yet had this dream and did something that is just transformative, of bringing robotics into Afghanistan, training girls, and having gone through enormous challenges, and then losing it all again. And then this is a young woman who's picked everything up and has rebuilt again, and then she's being awarded. And I thought it was beautiful. What I wanted the audience to see is, there's too often an inclination to look at Afghanistan through the lens of war and tragedy, to treat Afghans as victims and not as agents and as leaders. And I wanted them to say, look, this is the Afghanistan that you could be investing in. We constantly say that the Taliban have to expand their horizon. We have to expand our horizon when we look at Afghanistan. We cannot be cynical. And I think that too often, even those that have the best interests of Afghanistan at heart are cynical. They say, oh, well, this is just a minority. This is, these are just, we qualified. These are just urban women. These are just, this is the exceptional. No, this is in the fiber of Afghans who, they have very little, but they have hope, and they have resilience, and they have innovation coursing through their blood. I have had the privilege of talking to Afghans from all walks of life. That is there. That is what it needs to be invested in. And not just look at it as a humanitarian tragedy where they just have to deal with the Taliban, who's going to take them back to the 13th century, and it's as good as it gets. Yeah. There's a sense of we can walk away from this, because we tried for the last 20 years. It didn't work. A lot worked, and we cannot walk away from it. This is the Afghanistan that we can have, that can be a partner to the international community.
In the interview, she spoke about, as you mentioned, robotics. She talked about Afghanistan as a tech hub almost. That would surprise a lot of ears in the West and other parts of the world, right? Which yes, I think speaks to the importance of a platform like this.
It is, because that is the narrative through which Afghanistan has been seen. I'm of Afghan heritage. And, I grew up seeing Afghanistan through that lens, and my family they just didn't understand, why is it that we're looking at this much of Afghanistan? And the world has only grown to understand Afghanistan, to see Afghanistan through the lens of war, and they think that that's the full reality. And when they think of modernization, they think they brought modernization to Afghanistan. They don't look back into history. It's modern Afghanistan traces back to the 1920s, where there was a lot of progress in Afghanistan that wasn't, and it wasn't present in other parts of the region that have now moved much further. But it's what you see in Afghanistan. It's not culture. It's not religion. It is radicalization and the trauma of war. But unfortunately, that's the only lens through which it's seen.
Similarly to that attitude that you speak of, we see these incredible images and videos yesterday of these young girls marching for their right for education. And some of these young girls speaking straight into the lens of a smartphone and broadcasting themselves across the world, calling for their right to education, their right for a future, a future for their own children to be, and all these kind of things. For those who might not be so familiar with the situation on the ground, just how brave and astounding are those women? What was it like to see that? And what's the message that you think they're sending?
Every time that I see this, I am just speechless. It's just awe-inspiring. I don't know that type of courage. These young girls who have been pretty much under house arrest, who've lost everything in the last 7 months. Many have lost their homes. Many don't have food or don't know where the food is coming the next day. They have lost their schools, they have lost their future, they have lost families. This has all happened. Even a tiny fraction of that happening to any one of us, we would feel traumatized for life. These are the scars that we would feel have debilitated us. Yet these girls get up and march to it, knowing fully well that this is a Taliban that is detaining people for exactly that or even less. They are not just detaining them; they're detaining their families. They have disappeared people. They are putting these women's pictures on social media, forcing them to confess to crimes that they haven't committed. They know all of this, yet they go out and they do this. And they do this because, and I've heard even before this, when I've talked to Afghan women, they say, what we face is death. Maybe it's not physical death. Maybe it is physical death, but what we are talking about is our spiritual death, the death of our future. And for that, we risk everything. And if they're risking that much, we need to stand behind them. I think it should make us all hang our heads a little bit to see these incredibly brave girls who are, risking everything because they want something as basic as education. If we don't stand for that, I don't know what we stand for. We talk about our principles and values, particularly in the West, that's what defines us. But they're walking the talk, We need to stand behind them when they do that.
When you put it like that, it feels like a difficult conversation to have. When we were talking to the executive director of UNICEF, she said something interesting. She said that there's a disconnect at the higher levels of the Taliban in terms of mindset.
Yeah.
There's more conservatism in certain areas. She wouldn't describe them as progressives in other areas, but more lenient and open to conversation. Do you feel as though that's the experience you've come to understand as well?
Yes, I agree. I don't think that the Taliban are monolithic. I think like any group, there's a spectrum, and there are challenges that they face. There are some, whether it's for pragmatic reasons or they have had a shift of heart, we don't know. But there are some that recognize that it is a necessity to move forward, at least on some fundamental areas. Girls getting access to education, I do believe that there are some who wanted this to happen, who believed that they would that it would happen, and are also very disappointed that they couldn't deliver on this. And there are on this front, we can say that the hardliners won. But I would say to the Taliban, you have said that you want to end this war. You believe you have ended this war. You have said that you want to make Afghanistan less donor dependent, sustainable. You want to stop the brain drain. You want people to come back to Afghanistan. You will achieve none of that if you don't give people their basic rights. This is, they're at a critical juncture. They need to realize this. They are either going to self-destruct, and unfortunately they will destroy the country with them and take it down another cycle of war, or they can stand back and recognize that this is what the people of Afghanistan want. This is not something that the West is imposing, but it's the people. It's Afghan families, young girls who are risking everything, because this is the future. This is the one thing that will give them some element of hope that there's a future to work towards.
What are the hardliners afraid of then? You talk about the message they send, they're not backing that up with practical decisions. Why did they 180 on the decision to send girls back to school? What's the message here? What are they trying to say?
I'm going to conjecture because I'm going to make some assumptions. One is I think there's an element of fear. And it's a fear, they haven't demonstrated any capacity to govern. And the last 7 months, the only form of governance they have shown is cracking down on women's rights, girls' rights, media rights, and just taking away rights. And that has been a message to their foot soldiers that, we're ideologically pure. That's about it. They haven't been able to deliver on any other front. In terms of humanitarian aid, it's been the international community, and they've just sort of thrown that to the international community. You take care of our people. It's a lack of imagination. It's trying to show ideological purity because you have nothing else to show. It's and a rigidity that shows that they feel that they don't have anything broader to offer the population. I think it's one that leaves, I think, all of us with concern. If they don't open up space, there will be conflict in Afghanistan. There will be massive migration out of the country because it's just basic. People want an education so that they could, or their daughters to get an education so that they can work and they can put food on the table and that they can have a future where there's economic viability for their families. It's basic. If they can't have that, they're not going to stay. So we will get all of the things that the Taliban don't want. We will have pockets of violence, or there may be different ways that violence escalates again. Pockets of resistance, in many different ways. The thing that they're most proud of, that they've stopped the conflict, that the conflict has come to an end, is not going to be there anymore. And there will be, for people leaving the country, regardless of how much they try to impose restrictions, people are going to find their way out. We've seen it, not just in Afghanistan, in other parts of the world. And so what I hope is that those elements of the Taliban that at least recognize what's at risk can at least convince the other parts of the Taliban that this is a necessity. If they don't, they will fail. And they should have no illusion that it would amount to something different from that. And the region needs to recognize that. And there is going to be a consequence for the Taliban, sadly for the Afghan people, for the region, and in terms of migration, it's going to affect the world. It's not a tragedy that it's just going to bleed into Afghanistan. It will bleed out.
I want to come back to that point about the region and the world. It's very important. But what would failure look like to the Taliban?
Failure would look like, I think, the population resisting. I think they'll call it something else. They'll say that it's, this is being this is being seeded from the outside. But I think the more that they lose control and the population starts resisting, that will be failure. When countries like Pakistan and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, start taking a harder stance towards them, and they see that this is not, they put the West in a box in terms of, they're just, imposing this on us. But I think if the Muslim world reaches out to them and says this is not acceptable, and that they see that they could potentially lose their allies, that's going to be failure. If they start fragmenting as a movement, that's going to be a failure. And there is they have to recognize that that is a risk. Right now, they have prioritized their internal cohesion beyond everything, beyond the fate of the people, beyond getting the financial support from the international community. It's short-term thinking that I think in the end it's not tenable, because there are elements of the Taliban that realize that in the long run, this is going to hurt them.
There's been, and I believe rightly so, and the reasons have been discussed at length, but there's been a bit of outcry about how the coverage of the Ukrainian invasion, particularly obviously in the West, sort of significantly dwarfs the coverage of and outcry, I suppose, of what's been happening in Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East for a very long time. Is that an opportunity for a bridge to say to people, okay, now you see almost on your doorstep suffering, let's have another conversation about what's happening slightly further away. Let's reassess how we think about this situation, how we think about these children, how we think about these families, what they're going through, the plight of refugees, the plight of being displaced from education, all of these things that are just being talked about as the horrors and tragedies that they are, but not in parts of the world where they're equally as severe, if not in certain cases more so.
I think that should be the case. I think there should be a recognition that the situation of Ukraine is an enormous tragedy, and it's devastating. It's also devastating for Afghans, because for them it's so triggering when the Soviet tanks rolled into the country, and many of them talk about this in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. It's a tragedy of just such magnitudes, but it also there is now even more challenge in terms of raising funds for humanitarian, and a country that's still facing deep food insecurity. Over half the population is at risk of maybe we don't. I think we've stepped away from famine, but deep food insecurity and economic collapse. And that hasn't just gone away. It's just that the attention has shifted. But I do think that the right approach would be to say that we should be able to do more things than and all the complexity of both situations. They both require attention. They both require support. A hungry Ukrainian child is no different from a hungry Afghan child, and we cannot simply just turn our backs to another country where the implications are severe from a moral imperative, a humanitarian imperative, a security imperative. All of the things that made us pay attention to Afghanistan, they're still there. We're just not turning the spotlight, and it's unfortunately it's short-sighted. But what I do note, particularly, this is why it's good that this conversation is happening in Doha, because I also note to the Muslim majority countries, for Europeans, many of them talk about Ukraine as their 9/11. That is a reality. They see they see this as a really significant moment and they're pivoting towards it, and that's. There's still a lot of engagement and interest in Afghanistan, but that is going to continue to be the case. And the Muslim world, Muslim majority countries, need to see Afghanistan as not something, for the last 2 decades, there's been an assumption that the US and the West is going to prioritize and focus on Afghanistan. And now there are those shifts. And while the US and the Europeans, they continue, that there's a continued effort and attention, but more is going to be required from the Muslim majority countries. More is going to be required from the region. And I would want, and there's, the whole, as I noted, the whole world will pay if Afghanistan falls apart. But where it's going to hit first is the region in terms of radicalization, in terms of all of the ways that it could become, it becomes a domino effect in an area that's quite unstable, and that can't risk, more pockets where radicalization could emerge. And Afghanistan is at risk of being that if the situation continues and if the Taliban create a situation in which conflict reemerges.
You use this phrase, short-sightedness. We've heard that a lot today in a lot of different contexts. We were having a conversation with Charles Lester from the Middle East Institute earlier, and he was talking about Syria. And he said something that I thought was interesting. He said, the foreign policy approach to Syria seems to be contain what is happening inside, but without a proactive solution to going in and fixing. Does that ring true in Afghanistan as well?
I think what is missing from Afghanistan is a longer-term approach and a big approach. There's, in terms of, I think, collectively, the international community, and there, we talked about this inside the government, that we have sort of an immediate need to address the humanitarian situation, but we need that to look through a long-term lens, and we need our partners and allies to look at it through a long-term lens. Because, if you look at it, we tend to forget history. We're ahistorical, and that's very problematic. I mean, there's a generation that doesn't remember 9/11 at all, and the decades of conflict in Afghanistan has shown that what happens in Afghanistan ends up having a pretty significant impact on, beyond its own borders, and in a way that, I think most of the world, if they look back at history, can take stock of and recognize. We need to figure out, and not just in Afghanistan, just in Syria and other places, we need more innovation. We need to really look at how we're doing things and how we could do things differently. For example, in Afghanistan, it's a tragedy of epic proportions, but there's also some seeds to work with. For example, I mean, what we supported and invested in the last 2 decades, the assumption is that because the leadership is gone, because the institutions are gone, that it's all gone. But no, we see it in the people, that there's a resilience, there's a determination, and so the seeds were not in those institutions necessarily. The seeds weren't, and our organizations being there. It's in those people, and those are the people that need to be invested in. Right now, we are in the immediate term, we're working with UN agencies. We can't work with the Taliban, but simply establishing parallel institutions is not going to be sufficient. We need to figure out how to support Afghan women and men, civil society directly, to provide funding. We can be very creative. This is a moment of creativity where there's less funding, but it can go a much longer way. We just cannot make the same mistakes that we have. We cannot have bloated organizations running humanitarian organizations and having sort of short-term projects. We failed pretty spectacularly on some fronts. Some of it is really on us in terms of how we engage. And it's not just in Afghanistan. If you look, I worked for the UN. I was a mediation advisor in many conflicts. And you see that we are applying sort of a very faulty model in many different contexts. And it's not working. There's an opportunity to step back in terms of how we are engaging with, putting. I love the UN. I think the UN is very important, but ultimately, what we've seen is, sometimes in the ways that we engage, One, we diminish accountability of governments. We create a dependence on international organizations. We don't invest sufficiently in local communities. And these are areas I think that we have a very challenging environment to work with. But it might, if we make the assumption that it's not whether or not to support, but how. How do we actually support this generation that we've worked with for the last 2 decades from all over the world? How can we get there? We might end up having some very interesting models. I mean, already having conversations with Afghans who say, the trauma has, to some extent, has passed. There's a lot of trauma invariably that's there, but now they're trying to get on with business. They're trying to figure out, how can we work with the Taliban? What can we do at the local level? But what they say is we are being crushed not just by the Taliban, but by the donor community pulling their resources from us. Or they say, there's a lot of, the work that's being done is by these large organizations and there's no room for us. It's cutting off our oxygen. So to support, we are there to endure, and we will do what we need to do, but we need some help. And we have to figure out how to do that better.